Greetings, my name is Blaze, and I debated doing this video for some time now, but I decided to finally go ahead and do it. So let's talk about how you become a Norse pagan. This video is going to be a long one. I'm going to cover a lot of topics that I feel are essential if you want to start getting into Norse, Nordic, paganism, heathenism, spirituality. The topics that I'm going to cover, and I'll put links below in case you want to reference these later. So to begin with, I want to be very clear, and this is my disclaimer. I am not a scholar. I am not anyone of great renown. I am someone who has a passion for the things that I research, and I just want to share with you the things that I've researched. The entire purpose of me making this video was because I have found that there's a lot of folks that are starting to get into Nordic, Germanic paganism. And I find that none of us have all the answers. But by sharing our resources, our knowledge, and our wisdom with one another, we might be able to unravel and find some together. So the intent and purpose of this video is to inspire you and to give you some things to start researching so that you can further your own journey. Now, I first started my path of researching and branching out probably in 1994 when I was 13. I started developing an interest. I was raised on different stories. One of the things that I did as far as my personal background goes, and the reason that I'm so interested in this particular study, and this is by no means the only thing that I study, I have a high fascination with Druidry and the revival movements there because of my ancestry, and I have a high fascination with the Nordic revival movements because of ancestry. I do study and have researched and looked at other things. I've collected all sorts of books, watched videos, etc. And when it comes specifically to the Nordic revival movements, it's part of my heritage and family. I can actually trace my heritage back to Norway, back to the 900 CE when they first came over to Iceland. My grandma was actually born and raised in Iceland and came over here when she married my grandfather. My mother also was born in Reykjavik. So for me, it was a journey about discovering where my ancestors had come from and what they might have done. So I like some of the historical aspects as well as the spiritual revival aspects of it. Regardless of my biological connection to this path, and regardless of how long I've been studying and researching, all of that is irrelevant. The only person that you need to hold yourself accountable to is who you were yesterday. So there's no oh, I've studied this longer. That means nothing. I've bounced around and I've studied a whole bunch of different things, and there's very little information available. So there it is. No credentials, just an enjoyment of what I like and what I'm trying to research. But again, let me share some of the things that I've found with you. I would also like to mention and point out that most of my research and study has been on the Icelandic version of the revival movements because, again, I have family that are connected and tied into that. Now, my immediate family doesn't necessarily do the revival movements, but I grew up on stories of Grilla and the different types of the Yule lads and things like that. I grew up on these stories that were little side stories, like little kids' stories that always fascinated me. And when my family would come over from Iceland and I got to speak with them, I always wish I could learn the language and be fluent in it. Unfortunately, I was never taught growing up, so I did research it a little bit on my own. Now, you don't have to learn Icelandic or Old Norse. Icelandic, they say, is the closest thing to Old Norse, so a lot of the pronunciations I'm going to use have an Icelandic inspiration. Not to mention, this is where a lot of our current material that we know of has come from. Ég tala bara smálves íslensku, en ég tala ekki vel. But, like I said, at least enough to understand me and get the basic pronunciation down. So let's talk about the first subject here, Nordic versus Germanic. This confused me when I first started branching out and starting to reach out to others and understand, are there other folks out there that might practice as well? Maybe we can share ideas. And a lot of people kept saying Germanic revival movements, Germanic paganism. And I was like, that's very confusing for me because, as far as I know, we're talking about the Norse traditions, Scandinavia, Nordic traditions. So the difference is, their Germanic traditions can be traced back to roughly 10,000 BCE, before Common Era. During, I would say, right around the time period 200 CE, there was a split, CE being Common Era, where the Nordic traditions in Scandinavia and kind of split off from the Germanic practices. So they're very similar. They're rooted in a similar origin, but they became, I would say, almost distinctly different around that time. When you think of the different deities that exist within these revival movements, sometimes you'll hear the name Odin, or as it's said today, Odin. That would be the Nordic side. The Germanic pronunciation would be Wotan, or Woden. This is because, of course, if you do speak some German, the W has more of a V sound to it. So there is both. It can be called either. You don't have to go with one name or term, and we'll talk about some of the names and terms for these revival movements in a few. But just be aware that if you hear Germanic or Nordic revival movements, many folks are typically referring to essentially the same thing. We do have a fairly large list of the Nordic gods and goddesses, so I'll put them on the screen because there's a lot. Some of these you may have heard of, but I highly encourage you to go research them to get more familiar with them. Let's talk about the history of these revival movements. Where did they come from? Where was the source of the information that we're trying to reconnect with? So as mentioned, 200 CE is where the Nordic traditions split off from the Germanic traditions and kind of ran in parallel and developed on their own. Right around the year 793 CE is when we start the Viking Age. Around 900 CE, Denmark converted over to the Christianity. 1000 CE, Iceland converted. 1020 CE, Norway converted. And then 1066 CE, Sweden converted, which is essentially the end of the Viking era. There is about a 200-year time period between the end of the Viking era until a lot of the folks in these Scandinavian countries decided, we have a lot of these great stories and rich heritage, so we want to start writing it down. So that's when we started getting the Sagas and Eddas and stuff. Iceland was the place that wrote most of it down. This is right around 1270 CE when we first get the Poetic Edda. So again, that's like a 200-year time period where we have the last practicing to the current modern folks like that were Christian that were writing these old stories. So it was sort of a secondhand experience. During the Viking Age and stuff, and back then, most of the stuff was an oral tradition and it was passed by word of mouth. Now, they did have a writing system. They had the runes, but these were typically used like name labels and stuff on packages or things that were owned or something that you created or craft. They didn't have full books and text, at least nothing that survived. So as far as we knew, there was no way of really tracing this. Now, you did have the rune stones, but again, these were little simple stories, and that's where we get some of these as well from some of this history. We see these big stone markers, these giant rune stones with rune script written around the corner of it. So we do have some things, but the books that we know of today and the way that we rate things today, we didn't have a really good record. And let's face it, and if a lot of that did exist, a lot of it probably got removed. Now, as conversions happen, though, you will find this in any sort of conversion situation where folks are going to hang on to their traditions. So there's going to be things that they will continue to do and not get rid of. So they might have converted in name, but there's still going to be some old traditions that you're still going to see that are going to be alive. Right around 1800 CE, we get to the Romantic era. This is where folks started getting reinterested in this Viking era material, and people wanted to really start reading it and researching and getting to know more about it. Right around 1900 CE is where folks started getting interested in digging up artifacts and ships and finding anything related to the Viking Age. And that's where we started filling up a lot of the museums and stuff, and you start getting more attention to it. 1930 to 1935 CE, the Nazis became very interested in history, language, and symbols. This is one of the parts where a lot of folks get confused and try to associate these revival movements with some of those groups. And honestly, they're not related. Not everybody who follows and does this stuff has anything to do with it. Are there some? I'm sure there are, because people can do whatever they want and can adapt whatever they want. But yeah, that's something to point out. And then in 1970 CE, in Iceland, we actually had Asatru begin as a revival reconstruction movement. I'm going to talk a little bit more about this later as well. But Asatru Feligith, I'll put it on the screen. They're still over there in Iceland. This is one of the first. Supposedly, there's some things that appeared here in America too. They're not related. They're completely separate. So that's the basic general idea of history by as far as Germanic versus Nordic and how it came in to the modern era and how we started getting stories written. So the next section I wanted to talk about is what did our ancestors used to do? What did the Old Norse and Germanic people, what did they used to do and how did they used to practice? We're trying to salvage the past, but there's not much that we know. And that's one of the first things that I think is very important to know if you're new to this, or even if you've been doing this for a while. We don't know. We really don't know a lot about what they used to do. A lot of the old practices are dead and gone, and we only have scraps. So just be aware of that as you're moving forward. So a lot of this stuff is reconstruction stuff. Here are a few theories. The remnants that we have are going to come from places like folks that wrote about hearsay stories that were handed down. We're going to have folks that are going to write about what they are able to read off of the rune stones that I'd mentioned. We're going to have folks that are going to have stories that were handed down in their own generational family, and folks are going to convert this into writing in the Sagas and Eddas. We have archaeological digs, we have artifacts, we have theories that we can come up with, and we do our best to try to reconstruct it the best we can. What I've gathered from my studies, from my research, from watching videos, from reading books, from talking to others, I get the impression that the old faith, first of all, had no name. There was no name for this old faith. It was part of daily life. It was something you did. They didn't separate it out. So when you're talking about these revival movements, that's one reason why I'm going to talk about all these different names for the reconstruction stuff, because they didn't have an old name. There is one group that tried to claim that the name came from Old Norse for their revival movement, but it doesn't seem like it can be accurate just due to the fact that they didn't have a name in Old Norse. And even when you look at the Sagas and Eddas, you do have different words that essentially translate into heathen, but these, again, are Christians writing about that time period. The other thing that I wanted to point out is it seems like it was a very personalized path. Each individual kind of did their own thing because, again, it was part of daily life. So they didn't separate it out. You lived your life and you adapted it to how you lived your life. If you were a farmer, a warrior, whatever the case may be. In my opinion, I feel like the Nordic Scandinavian people adapted stuff because they were travelers. Talking about the culture, there is a word that a lot of folks are familiar with called Viking. This actually comes from, as I understand it, it's pronounced Vikinger, which means to go on a journey. It means to travel. So it wasn't a people. They weren't the Vikings. Viking is something they did. They went on. It was a journey. Even if you related them to being Vikings, the people themselves were Nordic and Scandinavian, Germanic. They were Vikings as almost a job description or a temporary path in life. It would kind of be, in my opinion, the equivalent of trying to call the English people pirates. There were pirates that were English, but not every English person was a pirate. Not everyone was a pirate for life necessarily. And I equate that, in my opinion, very similar to the Nordic people. Some Nordic people were Vikings, but not everyone was a Viking. And even if you were a Viking, you wouldn't be a Viking for life. Now, why did folks go on Vikings? They would go on a Vikinger to explore. They would do it to settle. They would do it for trade. And yes, they would do it for raiding. They would raid to steal goods and people and take them back. It's, you go raid for a few years and then you have enough to settle down and have your own farm and farm your land, and they have enough to keep your family stable, or new lands to farm as you're going out to settle and conquer new land or territory potentially. With that in mind, you're going to see a lot of different types of cultures, people, religions, languages. So I really do feel like the Scandinavian people adapted and adjusted as they went through. The main things to get out of this, there was no name. They were adaptable and interacted with a lot of different people, and it was a personal path. I think that can be influential for how folks are trying to recreate it today, which is why I wanted to point that part of the history out. As folks try to apply different types of Nordic Scandinavian traditions, some people will try to adapt current polytheistic, paganistic paths and just change the name of the deities, but essentially do neo-paganism instead of specifically Nordic Germanic revival paganism. It's fine. There's nothing wrong with that. but just be aware that there is going to be a difference of opinion and people do fight about it. For example, a lot of people will say Thor, or as you would say it Romanized, Thor was the god of thunder. Not really. There was no god of or goddess of. The way that they wrote and described the gods and the goddesses, it was written about as there was traits and personalities. Yes, Thor was associated with thunder and lightning, but he wasn't necessarily the god over it. Same thing, Odin was associated with wisdom and battle, but he's not necessarily the god of wisdom. So this of concept, I see this a lot more in sort of like the Greek and Roman traditions with their deities and their pantheon. A lot of this is reconstruction stuff, so they're trying to reconstruct pieces. One of the things that they used to do, which a lot of people have issues with, is they used to sacrifice animals to their deities. We have evidence of this with blood bowls. We have stone bowls that actually have blood residue in it that were found archaeologically, that we know that they used to fill it with animal blood. The interesting thing is people are like, oh no, that's terrible, how could you do that? Well, first and foremost, this was typically only done during a blot, or basically a type of like ritualistic celebration / sacrifice. During this time, after they sacrificed, they would feast. Well, they're not just going to dispose of the carcass afterwards, they're going to eat it. So essentially, it's almost part of their butchering process. They're butchering, the blood's coming out anyway, they're not going to be drinking the blood, so they're going to give it to their gods in honor of their gods, because it's bleeding out that life, and then they're going to eat the rest of the animal. And folks that are uncomfortable with that, think about what we do today. As a society today, we mass slaughter animals unceremoniously, and then a lot of folks in their traditions at home will pray before the dead animal to their god. This has been common in today's society, so it's not really gone away, it's just changed. Obviously, this is not something you necessarily want to do. You don't want to butcher an animal in the name of your gods, unless maybe you're a hunter. If you're a hunter and you're hunting your own food, by all means, honor your gods as you're hunting. Personally, though, I'm a huge advocate for animal rights, and I don't like the idea or thought of us slaughtering animals unless, you need to, again, for survival, for hunting purposes, but most folks can just go down to the supermarket. So today, part of the reconstruction movement is to essentially change the way sacrifice works. Sacrifice is giving up of something. So you can sacrifice by crafting or creating something and burning it. You can purchase something and gift it to the gods. You can get an expensive drink of some form. And there are different ways of doing bloats, but you can essentially pour some out to the gods. So there's different things that you could potentially do. That's part of the reconstruction. As I'd mentioned, a lot of folks will mix in and they will kind of pull together with some of the other polytheistic neo-pagan revival movements, and they'll essentially just change the names of the gods. A lot of this stuff is inspired by the Sagas and Eddas. A lot of this is going to come from the Nordic Scandinavian areas. So what sort of areas are we talking about? We're talking about Norway, Sweden, Iceland, Denmark, and maybe Finland. Somebody once mentioned in one of my videos that they don't feel like Finland is part of it and they have their own traditions, and that's very possible. I've also noticed that if I talk to other individuals from different countries, they have slightly different traditions as well. So like I said, most of what I've experienced and researched has to do more with the Icelandic inspired or even Icelandic tradition. Let's talk about the names for the reconstruction movements. So as I'd already mentioned earlier, Asatru. So you'll notice the accents on the A's and stuff. This comes from Icelandic. The Icelandic language, as mentioned, is very close to Old Norse, but there was no old word for it. So Asatru essentially is a combination of Als, which is referring to the Aesir, which I'll talk about more once we get down to the terms, but they're essentially one portion of the gods that were worshipped, one clan, one group. And Tru means faith, so it's faith in the Aesir. And that's, again, a reconstruction movement that started in Iceland. If you were someone who was practicing this, one of the terms for that is Asatruermen. There is also Asatru, and I'm pronouncing it differently for two reasons. First of all, most of the followers and practitioners that do Asatru are in English-speaking countries, and it is completely separate. They were reconstructed in 2 different locations. There's a lot of different groups. And that's the other thing we'll get into a little bit later, is we'll talk about the fact that any of these names, there's not one set group that has, this is the way you do it, period. So you can essentially use any name you feel comfortable with. Some folks don't like Asatru or Asatru because they don't feel it fully encompasses the revival movement, because we're talking specifically about the Aesir, which is only one group of the old gods. Another one is Vanatru, which, like Asatru, focuses on the Aesir. Vanatru focuses on the Vanir. Odinism. Disatru. Fornsiðr, which is Old Norse and it essentially means old custom. We're talking about a revival movement without a name, so referring to old customs in that kind of makes sense. Fornsith, old custom again. Heathen, Sith, which is essentially heathen custom. Heathen, which again, it translates roughly to heathen. Finsidhu, Germanism, and then of course you can go with Norse Paganism, Norse heathen, heathenry, heathenism. You can also go with Germanic paganism or Germanic heathen. Or you just don't have a name, period, and you just do what you want to do. But these are just some of the names out there, so if you wanted to research more about them, there's some different flavor based upon what name they choose to use, what region, what country. There's going to be some variances there. All right, so the next part I want to talk about is what I'm recommending you should read. This is different than the book list I have. This is the type of stuff that I think that you should go and look up as far as creating your own version of the reconstruction. So you can go off of different folks that have had these different names. You can do different things where people have translated things for you, or you could actually go learn Old Norse, how to read it, get the basic understanding of it. You can learn Icelandic, or you can get a translated version. But either way, go to the source material yourself and make up your own mind about how you want to reconstruct it, because everything else is folks' interpretation and opinion. But you can have your own interpretation and opinion. So I would recommend looking at the Sagas, the Eddas, the Havamal, Tacticus, Adam of Bremen, his writings on the subject, Snorri Snorrason. So those are just some examples of the older sources that you can review yourself. So be aware of those names, be aware that they're very strong in the different movements, and be aware that you can look them up yourself. One of the things that I want to point out here before we go too much further, no one has the right to tell you how you can practice or should practice. If you're speaking with others, take it as inspiration and take it as things that you can take away and make up your own mind on. Some folks take it to different extremes. Some folks stay in the middle ground. Some folks keep them themselves. Some folks practice with other individuals. Unless you're practicing with others, there's no reason to let others dictate to you about which is right and which is wrong. Make up your own mind, do the research yourself, and come to terms with something that feels right in your own heart. So that's some of the advice that I would have for you as far as going down your journey. The next topic I wanted to discuss is, do you have to be of the blood? Are you allowed to practice the heathen revival movements if you're not Scandinavian, if you're not Germanic or Nordic or Norse, if you have no ancestor or heritage in there? Can you practice? And I'll give you the answer to that. Yes, you can. There are different schools of thoughts on it, and you have both types of folks. You have some folks who do have a blood connection and they will practice. And some of them actually believe if you don't have a blood connection, you have no right to practice. Then there's another group that says you can practice regardless of your blood. Sometimes they are of the blood, sometimes they're not, but they have the opinion that it's open for everyone. This is an interesting point of contention within the heathen community on a whole. And I wanted to bring some attention to it without going into too much detail. Because if you're researching this, I want you aware, if you talk on forums, if you talk on different communities or groups, or if you watch different people's videos or read their books or get their opinion, there can be some influence. I think that there is a strong advocation for both houses of thought, and this is why. On one hand, if you do have Scandinavian ancestry, such as myself, There is a sense when I'm researching that I'm coming home, that I'm studying what my ancestors did, that I'm looking into my own heritage family history. That is going to have a different type of meaning for me than someone who has no connection. I mentioned earlier that I study all sorts of things. I look at some of the Druid revival movements because of my Irish heritage. I'm looking at some of these heathen revival movements because of my Icelandic heritage. But I also study all sorts of different paths, and one of the other big influences for me is Taoism. I have no Chinese blood in me whatsoever, but it's very influential in a lot of the ways that I think and adapt stuff. But approaching that, not having that heritage, is going to be a little bit different for me than someone who does have Chinese bloodline and they're reconnecting with their ancestors. So again, I think there's some validity to a degree. I think there's a validity to at least acknowledging and understanding why some folks might feel that way. I have spoken with some folks that do Taoism trying to learn more about it, and I was actually shut down because I'm not Chinese. Not everyone was like that, but there were some. Similarly, I knew someone who was researching Hinduism, and they were straight up told they cannot be a Hindu and they can't practice Hinduism because they're not Indian. So it's like there are folks that have that. So be aware as you're approaching people, you might run into that. Don't let that dissuade you, though. If you don't have heritage or blood ties to the Scandinavian area, that's fine. There are plenty of folks who will share and practice with you, no problem. So just be aware of that. So the flip side of it, that's talking about why I can see some validity in having that blood tie, why it has meaning in a different way. And I can understand why folks to a certain degree say, well, this is my culture. This is my heritage. This is my family. This is mine. Why are you practicing it? You have your own heritage and family traditions. Why are you practicing stuff that I have a direct tie to through my DNA? So I can understand the thought process there. Not sure I fully agree with it because, like I said, I think anyone can practice, but I can understand where they're coming from. The other school of thought and the argument there is knowledge and wisdom belongs to everyone. As I'd mentioned earlier, I genuinely feel that my ancestors, when they went on their Vikinger, they adapted. They learned new things. They brought things back with them. When I did my DNA test on Ancestry.com, there are so many different little bits and pieces from all over the place because my ancestors went everywhere. You know, you're going to meet new people. You're going to interact with these different cultures. They're going to come back, intermingle. You're going to trade with them, meet folks along the way. There's all this intermingling. So it's going to happen. So again, what's wrong with adapting what feels right to you? So I highly encourage you, regardless of if you're researching your own heritage or you find it inspiring, do what works for you. The individuals that say you have to be of the bloodline to practice, the only ones I've met are in groups, and their group doesn't accept folks that are not of direct descendant of these bloodlines. That's fine. Go find another group. I don't think we should give hatred towards them, and I don't think we should attack them. Let them do their thing. If that's how they're practicing, that it's part of their ancestry, let them do it. Just know that's not everyone. Typically, a lot of people will call those folk traditions, and folk traditions apply to everything. There's folk heathenism, there's folk Chinese traditional practices, because there's like folk traditions that are culturally, again, there's a lot of culture involved with some of the ways that a lot of this is approached and some of the mentalities behind it. And you'll see this in the Sagas and Eddas on how people interact. The next thing I wanted to mention is whether or not you have to be straight. Now, I feel like this is a very weird thing to bring up, but a lot of people, I think, do have this question because, again, as with everything, there are two schools of thoughts. I've seen groups say that they prefer you or you have to be heterosexual, straight. Honestly, I don't think it has anything to do with the religion. It's a personal preference, period. Can you be of any sexuality in practice? You betcha. As I said earlier, do what's right for you. But there are folks who feel there are certain restrictions, and that has been brought up by some, but it's usually groups. It's not the community as a whole. Community as a whole, do what you want. Doesn't matter. So yes, you can practice. There are no restrictions there on a whole. Now, I don't speak for the whole community. This is my thoughts and opinions, but yeah, you're fine. I honestly don't know if historically there was anything that restricted an individual's sexuality. I've never read anything like that, so I don't even know if there's any historical backing to this thought. Like I said, I just think it comes down to the individual. It's not related. The next thing I want to talk about was gender identity. And again, this is one of those weird topics that folks are interested in. Very similar to what your sexuality is. It's an individual's personal thought process. It's their personal choice. You will find groups that don't acknowledge gender identities. You will find, especially in the US, that fully acknowledge it and don't care. You are who you are, you identify how you identify, and they fully respect it. It is not part of the religion to identify or to not identify different genders from your biologically born gender. Folks don't care. The ones that do care, again, they'll make it clear to you. So when you are looking for a group, if you want to look for others to practice with, just make sure you're on the same page and you're aware of what their personal thought process is and requirements to be part of their group. If you have a problem with it, find another, because they are out there. There's easy to find. There's plenty of groups that don't care. Now, this one might have some historical relevance to it. And I think, at least with this, if you look at the Eddas and Sagas, it seems like there was essentially gender roles that were pretty typical and common. Women had a very specific role that they played in these Nordic societies, and men had a very specific role. It seems like there was a lot more flexibility for women. Like, a woman could do things that were traditionally masculine. They even had, essentially, the warrior's role was essentially male for the most part, but you had women, stories about them at least, about shield maidens, which it's suspect of whether or not a shield maiden exists, or if it's just in the stories. But essentially, a shield maiden was a female warrior. There was even a grave found of a warrior that was buried with their weapons, and it ended up being a female skeleton. If a man was to do something feminine, it didn't seem like it was terrible, but it was looked down on. It wasn't acceptable by society standards, like you shouldn't do that because you're supposed to be this way. Even looking at a lot of the different European cultures, a lot of the languages, they have specific terms for male versus female. If you were to greet a male, right, in Icelandic, it's sæl. If you were to greet a woman, it's sæl. Sæl. So it's like there is this acknowledgement of gender within the greeting. I think that there is some historical relevance to a degree of the whole gender identity thing. But again, it's personal preference. It shouldn't restrict you and it shouldn't put you off. Just be aware if you're approaching groups. I want to point out that there are some extreme groups out there that have very precise ways of thought and practice. It's gotten so bad to the point where there actually are groups that are fully anti the thought of anything doing with restriction or folk thought. There's a document that I think you should be aware of that exists that's around this called Declaration 127. Again, if you're looking to get into heathenism and you're looking to get into these paths, be aware what's out there, be aware of the extreme groups on both sides. And honestly, regardless of where you feel you fit, or maybe you don't fit with any group and you just want to stay solitary, I just want you aware that they exist and that you have to find what works for you. This goes back to what I was saying earlier. Others can't dictate what's right and wrong for you. You have to find what's right for you. Follow your own moral compass. If it feels right, do it. That's all I can say about that matter for right now. Just do what feels right. The next section I wanted to talk about were some of the big terms. So I highly recommend that you research these terms because I'm not going to go into great detail about what they are. I'm just going to mention some of them so that you can research them on your own, do some more studying, and understand when folks use these terms. The first one I want to mention is frith. Frith is a type of relationship with family, friends, people really close to you. I wrote down a note here. So it's a type of kinship, and it's kind of a combination between peace, love, security, joy, delight, gentleness, loyalty, trust, affection. It doesn't have a direct translation into English. Just the terms kith and kin. And kith and kin is your family and your extended family in your village, your clan, your community. Grith. The idea of grith is if folks were debating and arguing, they had to peacefully negotiate in a diplomatic manner. Most people couldn't call for a grith. I would almost equate it to the word parlay. weird. Now, there's an Old Norse version of this as well called Urður. Most people say weird. There's this concept in heathenism of these threads and these weaves of fate. And the weaves of fate are kind of sewn and stitched together. The idea of weird is, it literally translates to the past. And it is basically destiny. And the idea and concept is, what you have done will dictate what will happen. Orlog. And Orlog is the finite universe that we find ourselves in. It's unchangeable. It's like, it's the laws of nature. It's the rules of our existence. Kindred. So I mentioned kindred earlier. Kindred is the term that is used for a local group that worships together. If you have a kindred, it's your community for spiritual practice. Gothar refers to the priest and priestesses in modern revival movements. You have the Gothi, which is your priest, and then you have your Gidya, which is the priestess. Huldafolk. The Huldafolk, or the hidden folk, are like elves and dwarves and spirit creatures that will live in rocks and whatnot. Magic is obviously not a Nordic word, but there are concepts around magic, but they're different in the Nordic Scandinavian traditions. So you have some words that might apply or be close to what magic would be. One of these here, I believe it's pronounced Fjolkingi, which essentially is Old Norse for much knowing or having a great deal of knowledge. The modern Icelandic version of that is Fjolkingi. Then, so that's, like I said, that's like the general idea of magic would fall into that classification, even though there's different sub-classifications, such as Scyther. Scyther is a specific type of practice that revolves around the concept of spinning threads, the weaves of people's lives, the weird of their lives, being able to manipulate and alter and kind of weave your magic and your spells. That is traditionally a very feminine practice, although Odin was knowledgeable in this because he's all about wisdom. There were male practitioners. It tended to be frowned upon because, again, it was thought of being very feminine. Golther. Golther, it roughly translates into spell or song. I like to think of it almost like chanting. It's interesting that the author J.R.R. Tolkien actually drew a lot of his stories in Lord of the Rings and The Hobbit from Norse traditions. And if you look at the way he wrote the wizards, it was very big on them speaking, and that's how they cast their spells. I kind of feel he got the inspiration for this from Golther. There is runic magic as well. The runes themselves, yes, they were a writing thing, and most people say they were just for writing. But there are different techniques for casting the runes and doing it like a divination type of a deal. But you can also use the runes for different effects. One of my ancestors is Eat Skallagrimsson. And in Eat's saga, there's an example of using rune magic in chapter 44 of The Slaying of Bard. His host offers him a lot of drinks and eventually ends up poisoning one of the drinks. Right before drinking it, Eat carves runes into the side of the drinking horn and chants a spell over it. The horn shatters in his hand, and as he's going to leave, his hosts panic and try to offer him another horn before he leaves. He throws it to the ground, draws out his sword, and kills him for trying to poison him. This could potentially be an example of both rune magic and Golther. Kingi, which I mentioned once more with there's much knowing, so there's just knowing. Kolkul, skål, so if you hear skål or skål, is essentially like saying cheers or good health to you. Viking, as we mentioned earlier, Viking or Vikingar, it's definitely worth understanding that wasn't necessarily people, but I have noticed that there are some folks that do refer to themselves as Vikings. Apparently, in Norway, there's one YouTuber I will recommend later, they refer to themselves as a Viking, and they refer to the people from the Nordic Scandinavian era as Vikings. They just call the people Vikings. Just literally the opposite of what I told you earlier. You're going to have differences of opinions. Find what works for you. Volva. But essentially, the idea is they were a magical practitioner, a wise woman. Not much is known about them. Some folks like to call them Viking witches, for lack of a better word. I don't like translating words like that because I think you lose meaning for what they are. Valhall, or as we often hear, Valhalla, the Hall of the Slain, Odin's Hall, where he keeps his warriors. After people die, the Valkyrie will come down and gather the slain and divvy them up between Freya and Odin. Not everyone who dies goes to Valhall. Other folks that die just go to hell. It's not like the Christian hell. Hell is like the earth, land of the dead, essentially. Ragnarok, which is supposed to be the twilight of the gods. Most of the Aesir die. Not all the Vanir do, but supposedly a lot of the Aesir die during the end of the world, so to speak. But it's more the end of the era of the Aesir. Megan, which is like your essence in a way. It's something that is a part of you, but you put it into things when you create and craft. When you write a poem, when you sculpt something. Doing this as a sacrifice to the gods by crafting and then destroying it to the gods is one way of connecting with them and giving them something that means something to them. One that I forgot to mention while recording is Hof, which is a temple or a building for gathering for the kindred. The next thing I wanted to talk about is different places. And what I mean is places as in planes of existence. So there is this concept in the Sagas and Eddas about Yggdrasil, which is the world tree. It's got the well of knowledge below it. It's got a serpent gnawing at its roots. It's got a squirrel that runs up and down it. This tree connects the 9 realms. The 9 realms are different areas in existence, and we usually only hear about a handful of them. Alsgard, which again, Aus for the Aesir. Alsgard is the realm of the Aesir themselves. Alfheim, which is the realm of the bright elves. Jotunheim, which is the realm of the giants. Mithengarder, or Midgard, which is Earth. That's where we are right now. Muspelheim, which is where the fire giants and the forces of chaos live. Niflvelder, where the dwarves live. Niflheim, which is the realm of ice. Svartalfheim, which is the realm of the black elves. Vanaheim, which is the realm of the Vanir. So you have all these different realms, and they're all connected. You can apparently travel to these realms through the Bifrost, which is like the bridge that connects the realms, which is kind of an interesting concept. And I definitely highly recommend you look into these more on your own, because there's a lot that goes into them. Probably worth at least mentioning here. If you want to look up the creation story, you can look up about Gununga Gap, where fire and ice met together, and between them is where creation came out of, and all sorts of stuff about like the giant Ymir and him being killed and his body being turned into the earth itself, and that Odin and his 2 brothers, Vili and Ve, came down and carved a ash tree and an elm tree into the first humans. Like, there's a whole creation story behind it, and there's definitely a lot of really cool stories to go research on your own. Let's talk about some of the beings that I think are worth mentioning. So the gods and the deities and the pantheons themselves usually fall into one of 3, I like to think of them as tribes or clans. So the big ones are the Aesir, which are like the gods of law and order, the sky gods, the higher up gods, like the nobility and the royalty. Then you have your Vanir, which are your gods and goddesses that are of the earth and of the land and fertility and the common person. So one's law and order and one's the natural world. And then you have the Jotnar. And the Jotun, are the ones that are associated with chaos and unruly, wild energies and whatnot. The 3 of them, though, is a lot of the gods and goddesses fall into one of those 3, and they intermarry a lot, which means they switch between them. That's why I think they're more like clans, because you can have a Jotnar, and she could marry into the Aesir, and then she becomes an Aesir, and they can have offspring with each other. So it gives this impression of them being very, very similar. Devgar, which is the word for dwarves. Dvevgar are multiple. Dvevgar is one. The Ulfir, or the Ulf, which translates into elf. There's not much known about the elves. There's a lot of stories about the dwarves, and they talk about them being great craftsmen and living in rocks and whatnot, but there's not really a lot about the Ulfir. You hear them mentioned on occasion, but we don't know a lot about them. Dokulfar, which is the dark elves, and then the Lojzafar, the light elves. So there's the light elves and the dark elves, which would almost... I don't know if necessarily the dark elves are the dwarves, or if it's like Drow in Dungeons and Dragons type of a scenario. It's not very clear, but those are different beings. The Valkyrie, which I mentioned earlier, they collect the slain and divide them up. The Norn. So the Norns are the weavers of fate. They're taking our weird and weaving our destinies together and helping to guide things through. The Norns themselves are actually named after past, present, and future. So Urther, Verðandi, and Skuld. Trolls, it's worth knowing about the trolls. The Vargr, or wargs, are like these giant wolves. A notable one is Fenrir. Fenrir is actually the son of Loki. He plays a big part in a lot of the Eddas and Sagas. Dreki, or like a serpent dragon type of a deal. The big ones to know about is Jormungandr, which apparently is the world serpent, and it's one that Thor will have to battle. And then there is Nithhogr, the one that gnaws on the roots of Yggdrasil. Draugr, undead, so like zombie, skeleton, vampire-like creatures that are once were living humans and they came back to Mithingardr from Hell or Valhalla or whatever the case may be, wherever they ended up, they come back and walk among here and they're called Draugr. So that's some of the beings that are worth researching and knowing about if you're getting into heathenism, especially if you're looking for some portions of different aspects. So the next part I want to talk about is the holy days. This is a very interesting conversation because, again, we don't know much about what they used to do. We know what they started doing as a more modern era when there was the conversion going on. It seems that there are some folks who essentially take the Wheel of the Year as used by other neo-pagan groups and apply Norse heathen type of names to those holidays. However, one of the things that I think we need to keep in mind is in the Scandinavian areas, even today, because this is true about where they're located in the world, they have two seasons. The first season is essentially all summer, light all the time. And the other season is essentially all winter, dark all the time. And then, of course, you have the two transitional sides, but they're very short, as I understand it. I have not had a chance yet to go visit any, but that's the understanding that I have. So if we look at some of the blots and holidays and seasonal stuff from the Sagas, Eddas, and different stories, we see that there was at least three major ones: the beginning of winter, the middle of winter, and the end of winter. Those do seem to be pretty consistent with the old stories. That's not to say you can't celebrate the heathen Wheel of the Year as folks have invented it now. It's not to say that it's wrong in any way, shape, or form. It's just different, and there is an argument back and forth. The old one seems to be around the moon phases. The first one is Winter's Night. The way that it looks like it's pronounced in Old Norse, Nether, which again is Winter's Night. It's also known as Disseblot and Haustblot. This is harvest moon. Now, we actually can look at the moon cycles and we know when the full moon is for harvest moon. This would give us a very distinct day if we wanted to try to mimic it today. We would follow those moon cycles if we wanted to. A lot of people don't like this concept. Some do, but it's something that's been brought up on the internet and there's some arguments around it. Again, do what feels right to you. The next one is Yule, or in Old Norse, Jol, which is actually the way you still pronounce it. In Icelandic today, it's pronounced Jol. Now, with that, that is midwinter. They have, over the years, moved and transitioned that to the winter solstice. However, I don't know how well that sits with me personally. The reason I say that is essentially it means midwinter. The winter solstice is the beginning of winter, so to me it doesn't really match up appropriately. To me, I feel like this is more towards the wolf moon, somewhere towards, actually even towards the end of January. Not even so much as the beginning of January, December. That just doesn't feel right. And if you think, again, about how these were, winter's starting, so you have a blot to the gods to essentially survive the winter. You're in the middle of winter. We're almost there. Let's make it through. And then you have the end of the winter, and you're celebrating. Hey, it's time to go raiding and farming and settling and whatnot. So that kind of, to me, makes sense. But again, do what speaks to you. The last one is Sigurblot, and Sigurblot is like the big one right before the raiding season, where it's becoming warm and it's summer and there's day all the time. And that one, I feel like it kind of falls around, I would say, flower moon. So the full moon, the flower moon. That's my interpretation, because if you look at them, it's kind of like one full moon, 3 full moons between, a full moon, 3 full moons between, a full moon, 3 full moons between. It would be the middle of summer, even though we don't have any evidence of that being a big blot. Then there's 3 full moons, and then we're back to harvest moon. Now, every so often, there's a 13th moon, so this doesn't match up perfectly. So you might have to skip one every so often, but it seems like it's pretty reasonable to consider that. Again, this is just my personal interpretation of it. Take it for what it is. It's something to at least think about and consider. But there are numerous heathen calendars out there using the solar calendar instead of the lunar calendar. Adapt what works for you, celebrate when you want to. But again, that blot, the idea there is that sacrifice, that communion. It's a community thing with your clan, your kindred, your folk. It's about all of you coming together and celebrating it together. You can do a private personal blot whenever you want. But these big festival ones were big community things. Yule specifically was a 3-night celebration, as it was written down in some of these Sagas and Eddas. The next thing I want to mention, and there's so much to look up on this, I'm just going to read them off. You go research and find meaning for yourself, is the 9 noble virtues. This seems to be a modern, again, interpretation, pulling together the old wisdoms, but they are basically courage, truth, honor, fidelity, discipline, hospitality, self-reliance, industrialness, and perseverance. Symbols. So I think the big symbols to keep in mind, of course, are the runes themselves. The runes are actually referred to as the Futhark runes. The reason for this is the first couple letters in the runic alphabet spell out Futhark. There are different versions of the rune sets. This is the one that's most widely known, and it's usually referred to as the Elder Futhark. So you can work with any runes you want. You can use them for divination, you can use them for spells or sigils, however you feel comfortable. There's many different ways folks work with them. You can use them just for reading, and you can even try to read old rune script on old rune stones or different types of markers in museums and in historical digs. So you can do whatever you want with that, but runes are worth knowing about and knowing where they come from. The next symbol I want to talk about is Mjolnir. So Mjolnir, which, Thor's hammer. Mjolnir. A lot of people don't know how to pronounce that, so that's how it's pronounced. Mjolnir. The interesting thing to keep in mind is the Norse people did not have a hammer as a weapon. There is no war hammer. Now, yes, when you went raiding and pillaging and whatnot, or if you went trading, you could get other weapons, and there's no reason why they wouldn't have or couldn't have. However, the traditional Norse weapons, I don't have a shield, but they have a shield with a center bar that you held onto with a shield boss, and it was wood, and it had like rawhide leather around the corner, and it could pivot a little bit in the hand, so it could take impact blows and not like break your arm. So it wasn't attached to the arm, it was held by a pivot point. I'm not going to bring out my bow. You could have also like a sax or essentially a knife. I don't actually have a Nordic one, which is a shame. I do have some of the other more traditional weapons. I don't have a long axe, but you have like your bearded axe. There's many different types. This is just one type that was very common because your typical foot soldier could have this and use this for both actual farming type stuff as well as actual war. So it can be used for a lot of things. The spear was a very, 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 very popular Nordic weapon. This particular one's a boar spear with, I got the sheath on because it's razor sharp. You had your various swords if you were really rich. So you have your svard, your different types of svards. The reason I'm pointing this out is because Mjolnir itself is essentially a forge hammer. Now there's a story about how he got it, about Loki cutting off Sif's hair and having to get presents to make amends and get her hair back, and made a dumb bet with some dwarves. And the dwarves, of course, built 3 gifts against his 3 gifts, and Mjolnir was one of the gifts against Loki. And it was supposed to be a 2-handed warhammer, according to the story. And Loki interrupted it, stung the dwarf in the eye while he was forging, so they handled it and get finished, so it was shorter. And it was had the ability to actually change shape and size. And most of the Norse weapons of the gods, the Aesir, when they threw them, they could come back to them. So the Mjolnir and Gungnir, the spear of Odin, had the ability to be thrown and come back to you, which was kind of interesting. But Mjolnir specifically has a lot of association, obviously, with Thor, who used it. And before that, he didn't, have one specific weapon. So this was his weapon. But to me, the way that it's designed, essentially a smith's hammer. Because like I said, the actual Nordic people I have never seen myself evidence of them having warhammers as weapons. So what does this mean? It's associated with a lot of the different aspects of Thor himself. He is the guardian of Asgard and Mithengard. He protects us. He protects everyone. He's the protector. He is this peaceful, healing, crafting god that is quick to temper and very slow sometimes. He kind of misses some obvious stuff, and he's quick to act. So the idea and concept behind the hammer and why it's traditionally worn, we don't know, but it was very popular. We saw a lot of graves and a lot of amulets there. And there's all sorts of different amulets and talisman and things that were worn by the Nordic people. And I was able to go to the Viking Museum and see a lot of these, but this was by far the most popular. There are various designs. People will wear it for many reasons. I wear it because it's a heritage cultural thing for me. But you can wear it as a symbol of protection. You can wear it as a symbol of your devotion to heathenism. You are not required to wear it. It is not needed. But know that Mjolnir can be worn by many people for many reasons, and there's many different styles, and some of them can be based on authentic styles or just modernized styles. There's no right or wrong for it. Choose to wear it if you want, but be aware of it because it is a very popular symbol. The Valnut. The Valnut is an interesting symbol, and it's essentially, some people believe it is associated with Odin, and that each of the points of the triangles are associated with the 9 realms. It's also apparently related to death and transition from life to death, and of course, again, associated with Odin. The next one is the Helm of Awe. This is associated with protection and might, typically. But again, a lot of these symbols we don't know the actual meaning of. We can just do our interpretations. Another one that's very popular is the Svethorn, and this symbol apparently has to do with long, deep sleep. The next one that I think is worth mentioning is the Vegvisir. The Vegvisir is essentially, you'll notice it's very similar to the Helm of Awe, but it's also different. The way that the staves are formed at the ends. There is a difference between the two symbols. And this symbol apparently was in modern Icelandic magical manuscripts. So this was a Norse symbol which is supposed to help someone find their way when lost. So it's kind of like a seeking, searching type of a thing. The last symbol that's worth mentioning, and there's no specific one design for it, is the oath ring. Now, again, you don't have to have an oath ring, but it is believed by some that the oath ring was there to swear oaths on. That's why it's called the oath ring. And you would wear it as a bracelet. Some people might have worn it further up the arm, depending on how big it was. But yeah, there's a lot of different designs with it. But this is also a very common thing that a lot of heathens utilize today as well. I do want to point out that the Norse helmets, the Viking helmets, did not have horns. They were smooth skull caps. And that there is this misconception today that if you wear ancient old garb and you do some of these blots, some people are starting to refer to them as LARPers. And I don't think this is a fair association between, first of all, it's insulting both to the gaming community and those that are practicing an actual religion, faith, spirituality. It's live action roleplay is an actual game, and there's nothing wrong with it if you want to play that, but that is not necessarily related to this. And just because you're wearing garb to help you reconnect with your ancestors or a time period that you feel connected to, or just find interesting and fascinating, or having swords or weapons and spears, there's nothing wrong with that. Do what feels right to you and what you're comfortable with. The next section I want to talk about is the books that I own myself. So I listen to audiobooks. I watch YouTube videos, I read articles online. I've read most of these books or used them as references before. There are other books that I might consider buying one day. I just wanted to show you some that are out there. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on these. I just wanted to give you examples of some things that you can read. I might say one or two words about some of them. So the Saga of the Volsungs, and this is by Jackson Crawford. I've been listening to this on audio. The Poetic Edda, again, a translation by Jackson Crawford. Both of these are translations, by the way, from original text. They have them in both. Obviously, with most of these are going to be audio as well as actual physical books. The Wanderer's Havamal by Jackson Crawford. The Havamal, as I mentioned, is something you want to know, and I want to talk about this specifically. I feel it's important to research the Havamal because essentially the Havamal is a book that is like the wisdom of Odin. And the purpose behind the Havamal is to give you wisdom of how to act and to be honorable and noble, and to live your life very similar to a Nordic warrior might have. I do have a different version of it called the Pocket Havamal. And this one, and it's not that I don't like this, because this is much thicker and gives you more information, but this is really nice, quick reference. This is edited and designed by Carrie Overton. So it gives you good lessons and wisdom to just be aware of. So it's actually a really good one. And Valnut there on the front, which is kind of interesting with the runes beneath it. So yeah, that's a good one to have. Living Asatru. And I guess you could technically call this Asatru, depending, again, where it originated from. I'm just so used to saying Asatru whenever I see the word. But again, the Valnut there. This is by Greg Dux Shetler. Very good read. I've read this cover to cover before. It's a really good one. I like his take and interpretation. Essential Asatru. Now this one is Asatru because you can see the accent marks on it versus the other one. And this is by Diane L. Paxson. And the forward is by Isaac Bonowitz. And yes, I know there's some controversy around Isaac Bonowitz, but it's still a good book and it's still worth reading. I'm still in the process of reading it myself, but it's a good book. The Viking Spirit by Daniel McCoy. Good book. I've only thumbed through it. There's a website that references this a lot. That's why I picked this one up. I used to have The Rights of Othin by Ed Fitch, but I'm not sure what happened to my copy. I think I loaned it out and I didn't get it back. This one is Norse Magic by DJ Conway. I don't think I would necessarily recommend this particular book. It's not bad. I've got mixed feelings on it. But that's all I'll say about that for right now. This is Asatru, A Native European Spirituality by Stephen McNaughton. Now, I'm going to briefly say one thing about this. Stephen McNaughton is very folk in his view on Asatru. Look him up before you buy this book. Some people are really going to resonate with him, and others are going to really not. And there's a lot of controversy around him. Just pointing that out. Added that to my collection. I haven't gotten around to reading it yet, so I don't have an opinion on if it's good or not. But I was looking for anything on the Old Norse religions. So here is the Practical Secrets of the Northern Grimoires, Icelandic Magic by Stephen Flowers. And there's that symbol that we were just talking about earlier, the Vegvisir. So that's this is a good book. This is pretty well worth reading, and it's got some very interesting information. But if you're interested in the magical side of it, not just a religion, this is a good read. This is one of my favorite books that I own. I have it on audio because I loved it so much and I love hearing it. This is Norse Mythology by Neil Gaiman. Now, if you know who Neil Gaiman is, he actually writes comic books, but he is a writer, and he is a good writer. So what he did is he took all the old Sagas and Eddas, and they're translated, and he tells them in a story style versus just a direct translation. So it makes it real easy to follow, and it's a very, very, very good way to start getting into some of the lore. I highly, highly recommend this book. This is definitely one of the top books in my collection, in my opinion. And then the last one, this is a wonderful book. And unfortunately, apparently you can only get this if you actually attended the Viking exhibit, which I did. And of course, I'm showing some of the pictures from when I went there, but it's called We Call Them Vikings. So, and this is like the history one. And this is essentially more about the culture and the people and artifacts and different areas. So this is really nice because it's nice to know where it came from. Even if it's not researching your own history and where your family came from, it's still good to know where the origins of some of the stuff was. So those are the books that I own that are related. The last part I wanted to point out was some YouTubers that I have found a lot from that I like to use as a resource, that I like to watch and listen to what they have to say about it. So the first one I want to talk about, I own 3 of his books, Dr. Jackson Crawford. Dr. Jackson Crawford is an Old Norse specialist. He, as far as I know, he hasn't shared what his spiritual beliefs are, but I don't know if he has anything to do with the heathen revival movements. His videos are not about that. His videos are simply about his professional career translating Old Norse and trying to revive this essentially dead language. He does some pronunciation of how he believes it was said, but he has great information from a history standpoint. Just be aware that, as far as I know, he is not a heathen. Then there is Hurstwick. Hurstwick has a website. They have books that they sell, and they have the YouTube here, which is Thorolifr. And I'll give, of course, I'll put all the links below. But they essentially have both where they try to recreate Viking combat about how they might have fought, but they also have some talks on their spiritualities, and they have some wonderful talks on their YouTube channel. Highly, highly recommend checking their channel out. The main guy that was part of this, and as I understand it, Hurstwick might not necessarily be active very much anymore, but they still have legacy videos, but William R. Short is the gentleman who leads most of it. So you'll see him in the videos. He's got like a pretty long white beard, some long white hair. Awesome guy. I had the opportunity to speak with him through email correspondence. Super friendly, super nice, super knowledgeable. And he really helped direct some of the areas that I could go read and research further. But again, yeah, great resource, that group, period. And definitely worth checking his YouTube channel out. Or that group's YouTube channel out. The next one I have some mixed feelings about. Bjorn Andres Bull Hansen, and I might be butchering the name, and I apologize for that. So he is the individual I was mentioning earlier that refers to himself as a Viking because apparently in Norway, which I believe he's from Norway, I believe he's Norwegian, I could be wrong, but he said that in that country they call that area, they just call them Vikings to refer to the people from that time period. That's just what they call them, which I'm not saying there's anything wrong with that. He also is one of those individuals that wears more of a traditional garb, and he has some of the weapons and stuff, and he has some very interesting talks. Now, the reason I have mixed feelings on him is some of his talks I agree with, some of them I don't. Doesn't matter. He's worth listening to, and it's worth considering what he has to say. So I do recommend his channel. The next individual I would also highly recommend, and I might mispronounce his name, so I apologize, but Erith Hager. And his videos and him as a resource are just awesome. He goes into great detail. He's very knowledgeable. A lot of what he says matches up with other things that I've read or looked up. He, as I can tell, he is introducing this as heathen revival stuff, it seems. I don't know what his spiritual practices are, but he does give really good information. I believe he has something to do with archaeology. Now, he's never spoken with me. I've reached out to him a few times, but I couldn't get him to respond. But I would love to have a conversation with him sometime. Definitely worth checking his videos out. The next recommended YouTube, I'm not sure how I feel about the channel as a whole. I haven't seen a lot of videos, but the videos I've seen, I think that the information in there is good and it's worth listening to. But that's the Wisdom of Odin. I guess it's the Wisdom of Odin is the way they pronounce it, but I'm so used to the Icelandic pronunciation of Odin, or even Old Norse Odin. So his content, I think it's worth watching it and considering it. The next one, I want to recommend it, but I'm brand new to watching this individual's channel. Even though I don't agree with everything this individual is saying, Ocean Keltoi, and I might be butchering the pronunciation, but again, it's worth listening to hear what they have to say. It's great topics, it's great conversation, and it's great things to further your research. So with all of these YouTubers that I just mentioned, and I will post some actual articles and web pages below as well for you to check out, myself included, never take anyone's word as law or gold or solid or the only way. Take everyone's word as something to consider. Make up your own mind. Do additional research. There is so much more that could go into this video, and I know it was extremely long. I really appreciate you sitting through it. If you want me to expand on any of these other topics with my opinion, feel free to leave comments below. I'd be happy to share more if folks are interested in it. But I really wanted to give what I feel was a base starter data dump to someone who's interested in putting their foot into heathenism, or maybe someone who's been in it for a while and is looking for the next area to research. So I will again, put stuff in the description. May your journey be fruitful, and may you find what you're seeking. Don't let others tell you what you can and can't do. Find what works for you, and keep searching, keep reading, keep asking questions. And remember, the only way any of us can move forward is by sharing what we've learned together and discussing it together. Folks don't have to agree with you for you to have a civil conversation and discussion about beliefs and ways of practicing. So, all the best. This is Blaze. Thank you for watching, and consider a thumb up, liking, and subscribing.